The scream tore through the night like a mountain lion's cry, and Sullivan knew in an instant that something had gone terribly wrong at the O'Brien homestead, 3 miles west of his ranch. He had been checking his horses in the barn when the sound reached him, carried on the cold November wind that swept down from the White Mountains. It was 1882, and Springerville, Arizona was still wild enough that a man learned to recognize the difference between a coyote's howl and a woman's terror. This was neither. This was pain, raw and primal, the kind that came with birthing or dying, and Reed had a sickening suspicion it might be both. Margaret O'Brien had been alone out there since her husband Thomas died 2 months back, kicked in the head by a spooked horse while trying to break it for sale. Reed had seen her in town last week, her belly swollen with child, her face gaunt with grief and exhaustion. She had refused his offer of help with that quiet Irish stubbornness that made her green eyes flash, even when her hands were trembling. He had wanted to press the issue, to insist that a woman 8 months pregnant had no business living alone in a drafty cabin with winter coming on hard and fast. But Margaret O'Brien was not a woman who took kindly to being told what she could or could not handle. Now, as another scream cut through the darkness, Reed cursed himself for not being more insistent. He grabbed his heavy wool coat and his medical supplies, the same kit his mother had used when she served as the closest thing to a doctor this part of Arizona territory had seen. His father had been a cattle rancher, but his mother had been a healer, and she had taught Reed everything she knew before consumption took her 5 years back. He saddled his fastest horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Copper, and rode hard toward the O'Brien place. The November night was bitter cold, unusual for Arizona even at this elevation, and his breath came out in white clouds that matched his horse's labored breathing. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the grasslands and making the distant pines look like dark sentinels guarding the mountains. When he reached the cabin, he could see lamplight flickering in the window, weak and wavering. He tied Copper quickly and ran to the door, pounding hard. No answer came, only another cry of pain from inside. He tried the handle and found it unlocked, pushing his way into the small main room. The sight that greeted him made his heart drop into his boots. Margaret lay on the floor near the fireplace, her skirts soaked with blood and fluid, her face as white as fresh milk. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat despite the cold, and her eyes were wild with fear and pain. She looked up at him, and for a moment he saw such naked relief in her expression that something in his chest tightened. "Reed," she gasped. "The baby, it is coming too soon, too small. I cannot do this alone." He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands already moving to assess the situation. He had helped birth calves and foals more times than he could count, and he had assisted his mother with human births twice before she died. But he had never seen a woman this far along lose this much blood and still be conscious. "How long have you been laboring?" he asked, keeping his voice steady even as his mind raced through everything his mother had taught him. "Since afternoon," she whispered. "The pains started light, but they grew stronger. I thought I had time. I thought maybe it was false labor. Then my water broke and there was blood, so much blood, and I knew something was wrong." Reed pulled back her skirts, trying to maintain what modesty he could while assessing the situation. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. The baby was coming breech, feet first and far too early. He could see one tiny foot already emerging, no bigger than his thumb. If the child was born this small, this early, it would need warmth and specialized care immediately, or it would not survive the night. And Margaret herself was in danger of bleeding to death if he could not get the baby delivered soon. "Listen to me," he said, looking directly into her eyes. This baby is coming wrong side around, and it is coming early. I am going to help you deliver it, but you need to do exactly what I say." "Can you do that?" She nodded, her teeth chattering. "Is my baby going to die?" "Not if I have anything to say about it," Reed said firmly. He had no idea if that was true, but he knew that Margaret needed hope more than she needed honesty right now. "And neither are you. Now, I need you to push when I tell you to and breathe when I tell you to breathe." "Understood." What followed was the longest hour of Reed Sullivan's life. He worked with steady hands and a racing heart, guiding the tiny baby out inch by impossible inch. Margaret screamed and pushed and wept, and Reed talked to her constantly, keeping her focused, keeping her fighting. The fire in the hearth was burning low, so between contractions he added wood, building it up until the small cabin was almost stifling with heat. Finally, as the clock on the mantel chimed midnight, the baby slipped free into his waiting hands. It was a boy, impossibly small, his skin almost translucent in the firelight. He was not breathing. Reed had seen this before with a premature foal. He cleared the baby's nose and mouth with his finger, then rubbed the tiny chest vigorously with a clean cloth. Nothing. Margaret was sobbing, reaching for her child, but Reed ignored her, his entire focus on the fragile life in his hands. He remembered his mother placing her mouth over a baby's nose and mouth, breathing gently, and he did the same now, praying he was not too rough, terrified he was not being rough enough. Once, twice, 3 times, the baby's chest hitched. Then, like a miracle, a thin, reedy cry filled the cabin. Margaret sobbed harder, but this time with relief, and Reed quickly wrapped the baby in the cleanest cloth he could find, then handed the tiny bundle to his mother. The baby was so small that he fit easily in Margaret's 2 hands, his little face scrunched up and red, his cries weak but persistent. "He is so small," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Will he live?" Reed was already tending to her, delivering the afterbirth and pressing clean cloths against the bleeding. It was heavy, heavier than it should be, but it was slowing. "He has a fighter's spirit, just like his mother," Reed said. "But he needs to stay warm. His body cannot regulate heat yet, being this early." He worked quickly, getting Margaret cleaned up and into her bed, which he had dragged closer to the fire. He placed the baby against her chest, skin to skin, and piled every blanket in the cabin on top of them both. Then he built the fire up even higher, until sweat was running down his back despite the cold night outside. But it was not enough. He could see it in the baby's color, in the way his tiny cries were growing weaker instead of stronger. The cabin was warm, but not warm enough, and the baby was losing heat faster than he could generate it. Margaret herself was shaking with exhaustion and shock, her body unable to provide the warmth her son desperately needed. Reed made a decision. He stripped off his coat and shirt, leaving only his undershirt, and climbed into the bed beside Margaret. She looked at him with wide, startled eyes, but he kept his expression professional, clinical. "The baby needs body heat, more than you can give him alone right now," he explained. "This is not about propriety. This is about keeping your son alive." Margaret nodded, too exhausted to argue, and Reed positioned himself so that the baby was sandwiched between them, surrounded by warmth on all sides. He pulled the blankets over all 3 of them, creating a cocoon of heat. The baby's cries strengthened slightly, and Reed felt the tiny body relax against his chest. They lay like that through the long night, Reed monitoring both mother and child, adding wood to the fire whenever it began to die down, checking the baby's breathing and color every few minutes. Margaret drifted in and out of sleep, her body demanding rest after the ordeal of birth and blood loss. When she was awake, she would touch her son's tiny hand, marveling at his perfect miniature fingers, and Reed would see such love and fear in her face that it made his throat tight. He had known Margaret O'Brien for 3 years, since she and Thomas had arrived in Springerville with dreams of building a cattle ranch. She had been 19 then, fresh from Ireland with her new husband, her laugh bright and her spirit undaunted by the harsh reality of Arizona territory. Reed had been 24, already running his family's ranch alone after his parents' deaths, and he had thought Margaret was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. But she had been married, happily so, and Reed had kept his distance, offering neighborly help when asked but never pushing for more. Thomas had been a good man, if not particularly skilled with livestock. He had loved his wife fiercely and worked hard to build them a life. His death had been a senseless tragedy, the kind that happened too often in the West, where one moment of carelessness could end everything. Now, lying in the darkness with Margaret's son nestled against his chest, Reed felt the full weight of what this night meant. This tiny life, this fragile miracle, was all that Margaret had left of her husband. If the baby died, something in Margaret would die too, and Reed knew with absolute certainty that he would do whatever it took to prevent that. As dawn approached, Reed could see the baby's color improving. The little one was still tiny, still fragile, but he was warm and his breathing was steady. Margaret woke fully as the first gray light began to creep through the window, and she looked up at Reed with eyes that held 1,000 questions. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved his life. You saved both our lives." Reed nodded, suddenly aware of how intimate their position was, how improper this would look to anyone who did not understand the circumstances. But Margaret did not seem concerned about propriety. She was looking at her son, at the tiny miracle breathing peacefully between them, and her expression was one of such pure love that Reed had to look away. "He still needs a doctor," Reed said quietly. "Someone who knows more about premature babies than I do, and you need medical attention as well. You lost a lot of blood." "The nearest doctor is in St. John's," Margaret said. "That is 40 miles. "I know." Reed carefully extricated himself from the bed, trying not to disturb the baby. "I am going to ride for help, but I need to wait until full light. Copper cannot manage that terrain in the dark, not at the speed I will need to travel." Margaret's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "Do not leave us," she said, and there was panic in her voice. "What if something happens while you are gone? What if he stops breathing? What if I start bleeding again?" Reed covered her hand with his. "I will not leave until I know you are both stable, and I will make sure the fire is built up high enough to last. But Margaret, that baby needs more help than I can give him. He needs a real doctor." She closed her eyes and a tear slipped down her cheek. "I know, I am just so frightened." "I know you are." Reed squeezed her hand gently. "But you are also the strongest woman I have ever met. You survived losing your husband. You survived a breech birth with no help. You can survive a few hours alone while I fetch the doctor." Over the next hour, as the sky lightened from gray to pink to gold, Reed prepared for his ride. He made sure Margaret had water and food within reach of the bed. He built up the fire until it was roaring and stacked enough wood beside it to last the entire day. He showed Margaret how to keep the baby warm against her skin, how to check his breathing, what signs to watch for that might indicate trouble. The baby, for his part, seemed to be holding his own. He was nursing weakly at Margaret's breast, taking tiny sips of milk, and his color remained good. Reed estimated he weighed no more than 4 pounds, possibly less, and his head would have fit easily in the palm of Reed's hand. But he was alive, and he was fighting, and that was more than Reed had dared hope for in those first terrifying moments after birth. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the mountains gold and the grasslands bronze, Reed knew he could delay no longer. Every minute counted when it came to getting proper medical help. He put his shirt and coat back on, checked his supplies one more time, and knelt beside the bed. "I will ride as fast as I can," he promised Margaret. "If the doctor is in St. John's, I will bring him back. If he is not, I will find someone who can help. You have my word." Margaret looked up at him, and something in her expression made his heart skip. "Why are you doing this, Reed? We are not your responsibility. You could have stayed home, warm and safe, and no one would have blamed you." Reed considered his answer carefully. The truth was complicated, layered with 3 years of unspoken feelings and careful distance. But this was not the time for complicated truths. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because I could not live with myself if anything happened to you or your son when I had the power to prevent it." He stood to leave, but Margaret called him back. "Reed, wait. What should I call him? The baby. I had names picked out, but none of them seem right now. He is so small, so much a miracle. He needs a name that means something." Reed looked down at the tiny infant, at the way his miniature fist was curled against his mother's chest, at the determined set of his tiny mouth even in sleep. "What about Owen?" he suggested. "It means young warrior in Irish. Seems fitting for a fighter like him." Margaret's face softened. "Owen Thomas O'Brien," she said quietly. "Yes, that is perfect." Reed nodded, then turned and strode out into the cold morning before he could let himself think too hard about the way Margaret had looked at him, about the warmth he had felt holding her son through the night, about the dangerous, impossible feelings that were starting to grow in his chest. Copper was fresh and ready, and Reed pushed him hard from the start. The trail to St. John's was rough, winding through pine forests and across rocky creek beds, climbing up and over the ridge that separated Springerville from the next valley. Reed knew every mile of it, had ridden it dozens of times for supplies and business, but he had never ridden it like this, with desperation driving him forward and fear nipping at his heels. The sun climbed higher as he rode, and the day warmed slightly, though the wind still carried the bite of coming winter. Reed's mind kept drifting back to the cabin, to Margaret and baby Owen, wondering if they were all right, if the fire was holding, if the baby was still breathing. He pushed Copper faster, knowing he was asking a lot of his horse but unable to help himself. By mid-morning, he was halfway to St. John's, and both he and Copper were breathing hard. He stopped at a creek to let the horse drink and rest for a few minutes, his own hands shaking as he splashed cold water on his face. The night without sleep was catching up to him, and his body ached from the tension of the berth and the hard ride, but he could not afford to stop for long. As he was remounting, he heard the sound of hoofbeats and voices. A moment later, 3 riders came into view, heading east toward Springerville. Reed recognized them immediately, Doc Harlan from St. John's, along with 2 ranch hands Reed knew by sight. "Doc." Reed called out, relief flooding through him. "I was just riding to fetch you." The doctor, a grizzled man in his 60s with kind eyes and weathered hands, pulled his horse to a stop. "Reed Sullivan, is that you? What has got you riding like the devil is on your tail?" Reed quickly explained the situation, his words tumbling over each other in his haste. Doc Harlan's expression grew serious as he listened. "Breech birth, premature and heavy bleeding," the doctor repeated. "And the baby is still alive." "He was when I left at dawn," Reed said. "But he is small, Doc, so small. I have never seen a baby that tiny, and Margaret lost a lot of blood. They both need help." Doc Harlan nodded decisively. "I was heading to Springerville to check on old Mrs. Chen, but she can wait. A premature infant and a mother with postpartum hemorrhage take priority. Let us ride." The return journey felt both faster and slower than Reed's trip out. Faster because he had help now, because he was not alone in his fear and responsibility. Slower because every minute felt like an hour, and his imagination conjured 100 disasters that might have occurred in his absence. When they finally reached the O'Brien cabin, Reed was off his horse before Copper had fully stopped. He burst through the door, his heart in his throat, and found Margaret still in bed, still holding Owen, both of them apparently sleeping peacefully by the roaring fire. Margaret's eyes fluttered open at the sound of the door, and when she saw Reed, her face lit up with such relief and joy that it hit him like a physical blow. "You came back," she said. "I was so worried." "I said I would," Reed replied, moving to her side. "How is Owen?" "He has been nursing a little," Margaret said. "And he has not cried much, just small sounds. Is that normal?" "I do not know," Reed admitted. "But Doc Harlan is here. We met him on the road. He will know what to do." The doctor entered then, and Reed stepped back to give him room to work. He watched as Doc Harlan examined both Margaret and the baby with gentle, practiced hands. The doctor's face revealed nothing, but Reed could feel his own anxiety mounting with every moment of silence. Finally, Doc Harlan straightened. "Well," he said, "I have seen worse outcomes from better situations. Margaret, you did well to survive that much blood loss. You are going to need rest and good food to rebuild your strength, and you need to watch for signs of fever or renewed bleeding. But I think you will recover." "And Owen?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. The doctor looked down at the tiny baby. "He is very small. I would estimate he was born at least 6 weeks early, maybe more. His lungs are underdeveloped, which is why his cry is so weak. His body cannot regulate temperature properly yet. And he is going to have trouble nursing because he will tire easily." He paused and his expression softened. "But he is alive and he is fighting. Reed did right by keeping him warm and getting him to nurse. That saved his life." "What do we do now?" Reed asked. "Keep him warm at all times," Doc Harlan said. "Skin-to-skin contact is best. Keep him nursing as often as he will take it, even if it is just a few sips at a time. Watch his color. If he turns blue around the mouth or if his breathing becomes labored, that is a sign his lungs are failing. And pray." That is about all anyone can do for a baby this premature. Margaret clutched Owen tighter. "How long before we know if he will survive?" "Every day he lives, his chances improve," the doctor said gently. "But the first week is critical. If he makes it 7 days, I would say his odds are fair. If he makes it a month, I would say he will probably live to grow up." Reed felt something twist in his gut. A month. Margaret would have to maintain this constant vigilance, this constant fear for a month. And she would have to do it alone in this drafty cabin with no help and no support. "She cannot stay here alone," Reed said suddenly. "Not with a baby this fragile. If something goes wrong, if he stops breathing or if she starts bleeding again, there is no one to help." Doc Harlan nodded. "I agree. She needs someone with her at least for the first few weeks." Margaret looked between them, her chin lifting in that stubborn way Reed recognized. "I have survived worse," she said. "I can manage." "With respect, Margaret, no you cannot," Reed said bluntly. "You nearly died last night. Your son nearly died. You are weak from blood loss, exhausted from labor, and you need to focus all your energy on keeping Owen alive. You cannot do that and also keep this cabin running, chop wood, cook meals, and all the other things required to survive out here." "What are you suggesting?" Margaret asked. Reed took a breath, knowing he was about to cross a line but unable to see any other choice. "Come stay at my ranch. I have a spare room. My house is bigger and warmer than this cabin. I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Chen's daughter, who comes in 3 times a week and can help with cooking and cleaning. You and Owen will be warm and safe, and there will be someone there if anything goes wrong." Margaret stared at him. "Reed, I cannot impose on you like that. What would people say? I do not give a damn what people say, Reed said flatly. Your son's life is more important than gossip. And anyone who has a problem with it can answer to me. Doc Harlan cleared his throat. For what it is worth, I think Reed is right. The baby needs constant warmth and care, and you need rest and good food. Reed's ranch is the logical solution, at least until Owen is out of danger. Margaret looked down at her son, at his tiny face peaceful in sleep, and Reed saw the moment she surrendered. All right, she said softly, but only until Owen is stronger. I will not be a burden longer than necessary. You are not a burden, Reed said firmly. You are a neighbor in need, and helping neighbors is what we do out here. The move to Reed's ranch was accomplished by midday. Doc Harlan rode back to Springerville to fetch a wagon, and they carefully transported Margaret and Owen the 3 miles, with Reed riding alongside to ensure they did not hit any bumps that might jostle the baby. Margaret held Owen the entire way, wrapped in blankets, her body curled around his to provide warmth and protection. Reed's ranch was indeed larger and more substantial than Margaret's cabin. The house was 2 stories, built by Reed's father with plans for a large family that had never materialized. The guest room was on the ground floor, with a large window facing south and a fireplace that shared a chimney with the main room, making it one of the warmest rooms in the house. Reed had built up the fire before they arrived, and the room was almost stifling when he carried Margaret inside and settled her into the bed. It was a real bed, with a feather mattress and clean linens, far more comfortable than the straw tick she had been lying on at her cabin. She sank into it with a sigh of relief, and Reed felt a surge of satisfaction at being able to provide this small comfort. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Reed would wake before dawn and build up all the fires, ensuring the house stayed warm. Mrs. Chen's daughter, Lily, would arrive mid-morning with fresh bread and whatever food she had prepared, and she would help Margaret with bathing and changing while Reed discreetly made himself scarce. Margaret would spend most of the day in bed, nursing Owen and sleeping, trying to rebuild her strength. And Reed would check on them every few hours, monitoring Owen's breathing and color, watching for signs of trouble. The nights were the hardest. Owen would fuss and cry weakly, unable to settle, and Margaret would grow frantic trying to soothe him. Reed, hearing the disturbance from his own room, would come in and offer to help. They discovered that Owen settled best when he was held between them, their combined body heat and the rhythm of their breathing seeming to calm him. So Reed took to sleeping in a chair beside Margaret's bed, ready to hold the baby when needed, to add wood to the fire, to provide whatever support he could. It was during these long, quiet nights that Reed and Margaret began to truly talk. At first, their conversations were practical, focused on Owen's care and Margaret's recovery. But gradually, as the days passed and they both grew more comfortable, their talks deepened. Margaret told him about her childhood in Ireland, about growing up in poverty but surrounded by love, about the famine that had driven her family to America when she was 16. She told him about meeting Thomas in Boston, about how he had promised her a better life in the West, about the dreams they had shared. Reed told her about his own parents, about his mother's healing skills and his father's love of the land, about the loneliness of running a ranch alone, about the weight of keeping his parents' legacy alive. "Why did you never marry?" Margaret asked one night, her voice soft in the darkness. Owen was asleep against Reed's chest, a tiny warm weight that had become achingly familiar. Reed considered his answer. "I suppose I never found the right woman," he said carefully. "Most of the women in Springerville are already married, and the ones who are not are either too young or not interested in a life as hard as ranching requires. "That is not the whole truth," Margaret said, and there was a knowingness in her voice. "I have seen the way some of the women in town look at you. Sarah Jenkins practically throws herself at you every time you come in for supplies." Reed felt his face heat. "Sarah Jenkins is 20 and giggles at everything. I cannot imagine spending my life with someone who giggles at everything." Margaret laughed, the sound startling in the quiet room. It was the first time Reed had heard her laugh since before Thomas died, and it made something warm bloom in his chest. "You are allowed to be particular," Margaret said, "but you should not be alone. You are too good a man to spend your life without someone to share it with." "What about you?" Reed asked, turning the question back on her. "Will you stay in Springerville after Owen is stronger, or will you go back to your family in Boston?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I do not know," she admitted. "Thomas and I built a life here, but I do not know if I can maintain it alone. The ranch needs work I cannot do, especially not with a baby to care for. But going back to Boston feels like admitting defeat. Like saying that Thomas's dream, our dream, was not worth fighting for." "You could sell the ranch," Reed suggested carefully. "Use the money to start over somewhere else, somewhere easier." "I could," Margaret agreed. "But then what? Go back to working in a factory? Raise Owen in a tenement with no space and no clean air. At least here he has room to grow. He has land and sky and opportunity." "He does," Reed agreed, "and he has you. That is the most important thing." By the end of the first week, Owen had proven himself a fighter. He was gaining weight, slowly but steadily, and his cries were growing stronger. Doc Harlan came to check on them and pronounced himself cautiously optimistic. Margaret's bleeding had stopped and her color was returning. The crisis, it seemed, had passed. But neither Margaret nor Reed suggested that it was time for her to return to her own cabin. The unspoken truth was that neither of them wanted her to leave. Reed had grown accustomed to having them in his house, to the sound of the baby's cries in the night, to Margaret's quiet presence at his dinner table. The house felt less empty, less lonely. It felt like a home instead of just a place he lived. And Margaret, for her part, had grown to rely on Reed in ways that both comforted and frightened her. She trusted him with her son's life, trusted him in a way she had never expected to trust any man again after Thomas's death. When Reed held Owen, she felt safe. When Reed looked at her, she felt seen. And that was dangerous, because she knew she was still vulnerable, still grieving, still not ready for whatever these feelings meant. 2 weeks after Owen's birth, Margaret was strong enough to leave her bed and move around the house. She insisted on helping Lily with cooking, on making herself useful rather than being a burden. Reed protested, but Margaret was stubborn, and he eventually conceded that light activity was probably good for her recovery. They fell into a new routine. Margaret would wake with the dawn and nurse Owen, then bring him out to the main room where Reed had built up the fire. They would eat breakfast together, Reed reading the week-old newspaper from St. John's while Margaret cooed at Owen and marveled at how much he was growing. Then Reed would go out to work the ranch while Margaret tended to the house and the baby, Lily arriving to help with the heavier tasks. In the evening, Reed would return, and they would eat dinner together, talking about their days, about Owen's progress, about plans and hopes and dreams. It felt like a marriage, Reed realized one evening as he watched Margaret rock Owen by the fire. It felt like a family. And that realization terrified him because he knew it was built on temporary circumstances, on crisis and necessity, rather than choice and love. Except he was starting to suspect that the love part might not be as absent as he wanted to believe. He had loved Margaret from a distance for 3 years, but this was different. This was not admiration for a beautiful woman or respect for a strong spirit. This was intimacy born of shared trials, of nights spent huddled together keeping a baby alive, of conversations that bared souls and revealed truths. This was the kind of love that grew in gardens, slowly and with tending, rather than the kind that struck like lightning. And he had no idea if Margaret felt anything similar, or if she was simply grateful to him for saving her and her son. 3 weeks after Owen's birth, on a cold December afternoon, Margaret finally broached the subject Reed had been dreading. "I think it is time for us to go back to my cabin," she said quietly. They were sitting in the main room, Reed mending tack while Margaret nursed Owen. "Owen is stronger now. Doc Harlan said he is out of danger, and I have imposed on your hospitality long enough." Reed's hands stilled on the leather. "You are not imposing," he said. "I told you that." "I know what you told me," Margaret said. "But Reed, I cannot stay here forever. People are already talking. Mrs. Jenkins made a comment in town last week when Lily went for supplies about how convenient it was that I ended up in your house so soon after Thomas died." Reed felt anger flare hot in his chest. "Mrs. Jenkins is a bitter old busybody who has nothing better to do than spread lies. Anyone with eyes can see that you have been recovering from a difficult birth, that Owen needed specialized care, that there was nothing improper about the arrangement. I know that, and you know that, but gossip does not care about truth," Margaret said. "And I will not have your reputation damaged because of me. You have been nothing but kind and honorable, and you deserve better than to have people whispering about you." "I do not care what people whisper," Reed said flatly. "But if you are uncomfortable here, if you truly want to go back to your cabin, I will not stop you." Margaret looked down at Owen, who was feeding contentedly, his tiny fist curled against her breast. "It is not about being uncomfortable," she said softly. "I have never been more comfortable anywhere. That is the problem, Reed. I could get too used to this. I could start to depend on you to expect your help, and that is not fair to you. What if I want you to depend on me?" The words were out before Reed could stop them, and he saw Margaret's head snap up, her eyes wide. "What?" Reed set down the tack and stood, needing to move, needing to put his restless energy somewhere. "Margaret, I am going to say something, and you can tell me I am out of line. Tell me I am taking advantage of a difficult situation, and I will never mention it again. But I have to say it, or I am going to lose my mind." Margaret stared at him, Owen forgotten in her arms. "Say what?" Reed took a breath. "I have admired you since the day you arrived in Springerville. I thought you were the most beautiful, spirited woman I had ever seen, and the fact that you were married to Thomas, who was a good man, made me keep my distance. When Thomas died, I grieved for you for the loss of your happiness. And when Owen was born, when I held him and kept him alive through that first night, something changed. I realized that I did not just admire you, I loved you. I am in love with you, Margaret O'Brien, and I have no right to be, but there it is." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret sat frozen, her face unreadable, and Reed felt his heart sink. He had miscalculated. He had mistaken gratitude for something more, comfort for affection, and now he had ruined everything. "Reed," Margaret finally said, her voice shaking, "I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything," Reed said quickly. "I am sorry. That was unfair of me. You are still grieving Thomas, still recovering from nearly dying, and I should not have put that burden on you. Please forget I said anything." "I cannot forget it," Margaret said. She looked down at Owen, who had finished nursing and was drowsing against her shoulder. "Because if I am being honest, I have been feeling things too. Things I told myself I had no right to feel because Thomas has only been gone for 3 months. Things that make me feel guilty and disloyal and confused." Reed's heart stuttered. "What kind of things?" Margaret met his eyes. "Safe things, happy things, Like maybe I could have a future that is not just about surviving, but about living, about being happy again. She paused. I loved Thomas, I truly did, but our marriage was comfortable more than it was passionate. We were partners, friends. He was a good man, and I mourned him deeply. But these past few weeks with you have shown me what it could feel like to have someone who truly sees me, who understands me, and that terrifies me. Reed crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, careful not to jostle Owen. It terrifies me too, he admitted. I have no idea what I am doing. I have never been in love before, not really. But I know that I want to be there for you, not just as a friend or a neighbor, but as something more. If you will let me. Margaret reached out with her free hand and cupped his cheek. I am not ready to make promises, she said honestly. I am not even sure I am ready to call this love yet, but I know that I do not want to leave. I know that, when I think about going back to that cabin alone with Owen, all I feel is dread. And when I think about staying here with you, I feel hopeful. Is that enough for now? Reed turned his head and kissed her palm. That is more than enough, he said. We can take this as slowly as you need. No pressure, no expectations. Just let me be here for you and Owen, and we will see where it leads. So Margaret stayed. She moved some of her belongings from her cabin to Reed's ranch, and they established a new normal. To the outside world, Reed explained that Margaret was his housekeeper, helping to run his household in exchange for room and board while she recovered from childbirth. It was thin cover at best, but it was enough to quiet most of the gossip. As December turned to January, and winter settled hard over the Arizona mountains, the three of them became a unit. Reed taught Margaret to shoot, insisting that she needed to know how to protect herself and Owen if he was ever away. Margaret taught Reed to make proper Irish soda bread, laughing at his clumsy attempts to knead the dough. And Owen grew, slowly but steadily, transforming from a frighteningly fragile newborn into a small but healthy baby. The turning point came on a snowy January night, 2 months after Owen's birth. They were sitting by the fire, Margaret darning socks while Reed read aloud from a novel she had found in his mother's things. Owen was asleep in a basket beside them, his breathing deep and even. It was peaceful, domestic, perfect. Reed looked up from the book and found Margaret watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "What?" he asked. "I love you," she said simply. I fought it, told myself it was too soon, that I was just grateful or confused or vulnerable. But it is not any of those things. I love you, Reed Sullivan. I love your kindness and your strength and the way you hold my son like he is precious. I love the way you look at me like I am the only woman in the world. I love you, and I am done pretending I do not." Reed set the book aside and crossed to her, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. "Say it again," he whispered against her hair. "I love you," Margaret repeated, and Reed felt something in his chest unfold like a flower opening to the sun. He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, pouring 3 years of longing and 2 months of hope into the press of his lips against hers. Margaret kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his shirt, and when they finally broke apart they were both breathing hard. "Marry me," Reed said. "I know it is fast. I know people will talk, but I do not care. I want you and Owen to be mine, legally and truly. I want to wake up every morning knowing you are here to stay. Marry me, Margaret," Margaret laughed, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you. But not until spring. I want to give people time to accept the idea, and I want Owen to be strong enough that I do not have to worry every second about whether he is going to survive the day. Can you wait until spring?" "I would wait forever for you," Reed said honestly, "but spring works." They were married in April in the small church in Springerville, with half the town in attendance. Margaret wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, and Owen, now 5 months old and thriving, was held by Lily during the ceremony. Doc Harlan gave Margaret away, and Reed's fellow ranchers stood up as witnesses. It was not fancy, but it was perfect. The gossip that had swirled around them for months was muted by the obvious happiness of the couple and the health of the baby. Even Mrs. Jenkins had to admit that Reed had acted honorably, and that Margaret and Owen were clearly thriving under his care. Some people still whispered that the marriage had happened too fast, that Margaret should have waited a proper year of mourning, but most of the town was simply happy to see a good outcome from what had been a tragedy. Margaret sold her cabin and the land to a young couple moving west, using the money to buy cattle for the ranch. She and Reed worked side by side to build up the herd, and within a year, Sullivan Ranch was one of the most prosperous operations in the area. Owen grew strong and healthy, his early fragility becoming just a memory. He was a happy child, quick to laugh and curious about everything, and Reed loved him as fiercely as if he had been born his own son. 2 years after their wedding, Margaret gave birth to a daughter, a full-term, healthy baby girl they named Rose. The birth was easy compared to Owen's, and Reed found himself crying with relief as he held his daughter for the first time. 2 years after that, another son arrived, strong and loud from his first breath, whom they named James after Reed's father. The years passed in a blur of hard work and deep happiness. Reed and Margaret built a life together that was rich in love if not always easy in circumstance. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, market crashes and cattle diseases. They raised their children with firm hands and full hearts, teaching them the value of hard work and the importance of kindness. And through it all, they loved each other with a depth and constancy that became legendary in Springerville. Owen grew up to be a fine young man, smart and compassionate, with his mother's green eyes and his father's steady hands. He never knew Thomas O'Brien except through stories, but he knew Reed Sullivan as the man who had saved his life and loved him unconditionally. When he was old enough to understand, Margaret told him the full story of his birth, of how Reed had ridden through the night and held him warm and brought him back from the edge of death. Owen wept when he heard it, and he hugged Reed tight and told him he could not have asked for a better father. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Reed and Margaret stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over the mountains. Owen was 21 now, running his own section of the ranch. Rose was 18, beautiful and headstrong, about to marry a blacksmith from St. John's. James was 16, still finding his way but showing signs of his father's skill with horses. "You ever regret it?" Reed asked, his arm around Margaret's waist. "Marrying me instead of taking Owen back to Boston. You could have had an easier life." Margaret looked up at him, her hair now streaked with silver but her eyes as bright as ever. "Easier, maybe," she said, "but not better, not happier. You gave me everything I needed when I had nothing. You loved my son as your own. You built this life with me through every hardship and every joy." "How could I regret that?" Reed kissed the top of her head. "I am the one who got the better end of this deal," he said. "I was alone and you made me whole. You and Owen and Rose and James. You are my whole world." "And you are ours," Margaret said softly. She leaned into him, and they stood together in the fading light. Two people who had found each other in the darkest moment and built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. Inside the house, they could hear Rose laughing at something James had said, and Owen's deeper voice joining in. The sound of family, of home, of love. It was everything Reed had never known he wanted, everything Margaret had thought she had lost forever. And it had all started on one cold November night, when a baby had been born too early and too small, and a cowboy had kept them warm and ridden for help the moment light broke. Years later, When Owen had children of his own, he would tell them the story of his birth. He would tell them about the cowboy who had saved him, who had become his father in every way that mattered. He would tell them about love that grew from crisis, about families that were built from choice rather than blood. And he would tell them that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead to the best, if we are brave enough to let them. Margaret and Reed lived to see their grandchildren grow, to see the ranch prosper beyond anything they had imagined. They grew old together, their love deepening rather than fading with time. When Reed finally passed at the age of 78, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, Margaret held his hand and whispered that she would see him soon. She followed him 6 months later, dying peacefully in her sleep, a smile on her face. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains they had both loved. The headstones were simple, but the legacy they left was anything but. 3 children, 12 grandchildren, and more than 20 great-grandchildren carried their blood and their values into the future. The ranch they had built together continued to thrive, passed down through the generations. And in Springerville, where memories were long and stories were treasured, people still spoke of Reed Sullivan and Margaret O'Brien, of the love story that had started with a midnight birth and a desperate ride, of the family that had been forged in crisis and tempered in love. They spoke of it as proof that even in the hardest times, in the wildest places, hope could survive. Love could bloom, and miracles could happen if you were brave enough to fight for them. Owen Sullivan, who lived to be 83, never forgot the story of his own beginning. He never forgot that he owed his life to a cowboy who had refused to give up, who had kept him warm through the coldest night, and ridden for help the moment light broke. And he made sure that his own children and grandchildren knew it too, so that Reed Sullivan's courage and Margaret O'Brien's strength would never be forgotten. The story became part of the Sullivan family legend, told and retold at gatherings and holidays, embellished slightly with each telling but never losing its essential truth. It was a story about survival and sacrifice, about the choices we make in crisis, and the love that can grow from the most unlikely circumstances. It was a story about family, not just the one we are born into but the one we choose, the one we build with our own hands and hearts. And it was a story with a happy ending, the kind that reminded everyone who heard it that no matter how dark the night, no matter how impossible the odds, dawn always comes. Help always arrives. And love, true love, always finds a way in the end. That was the legacy Reed and Margaret left behind. Not just a thriving ranch or a large family, but a story of hope. A reminder that in the wild, untamed West, where life was hard and death was close, human kindness and love could still triumph. That a baby born too early and too small could grow up strong and happy. That a widow and a bachelor could find each other and build a beautiful life. That tragedy could lead to joy if you were brave enough to take the chance. The Sullivan Ranch stood for generations, a testament to the love and hard work of its founders. The family prospered, spreading throughout Arizona and beyond, but they always remembered their roots. They remembered the night Owen was born, the cowboy who saved him, and the love story that followed. They remembered because stories like that were worth remembering, worth preserving, worth passing down. And on quiet nights, when the wind blew down from the White Mountains and the stars shone bright over Springerville, people swore they could still feel the presence of Reed and Margaret, watching over the land they had loved, the family they had built, the legacy they had left behind. It was a comforting thought, a reminder that love like theirs did not die but lived on, woven into the very fabric of the place and the people they had touched. The story of Reed Sullivan and Margaret O'Brien was more than just a tale of survival or romance. It was a story about what it meant to be human, to care for each other in our darkest moments, to build something lasting from temporary circumstances. It was about the choices we make and the love we give, about how one night of crisis can change everything if the right people are there to meet it. And most of all, it was a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It was complete, resolved, with every thread tied off and every question answered. It was the kind of story that satisfied something deep in the human soul, the need to know that things work out, that good people find happiness, that love conquers all. Reed and Margaret had their happy ending. They had decades of love and partnership, children and grandchildren, a life built on mutual respect and deep affection. They had their struggles, certainly, but they faced them together, and that made all the difference. They had each other, and they had their family, and in the end, that was all that mattered. The ranch thrived for over a century under Sullivan ownership, a beacon of stability and success in a changing world. The original house, where Margaret had recovered and where Reed had declared his love, was preserved as the heart of the family compound, updated and modernized but never lost. Future generations of Sullivans were raised in that house, learning the stories of their ancestors, understanding the weight and the gift of their legacy. Owen's grandson, in the 1940s, would write a book about the family history, including the dramatic story of his grandfather's birth. The book became a local bestseller, capturing the imagination of people who longed for stories of the Old West, of courage and love and survival against the odds. It was later adapted into a radio play, bringing the story of Reed and Margaret to an even wider audience. But even with all that attention, the core truth remained unchanged. Reed Sullivan had loved Margaret O'Brien with his whole heart. He had saved her son and made him his own. He had built a life with her that was filled with joy and purpose. And Margaret had loved him back, completely and without reservation, giving him the family and home he had always longed for. That was the story. Simple in its telling, profound in its truth. A cowboy, a widow, a baby born too soon, and a love that saved them all. It was everything a story should be, and it was real, grounded in the red dirt of Arizona and the endless sky of the West. And so the story ended, not with a question or a cliffhanger, but with a sense of completion. With the knowledge that Reed and Margaret had lived well, loved deeply, and left a legacy that would outlast them. With the certainty that Owen had grown up healthy and happy, that Rose and James had thrived, that the family had prospered. It was a good ending. A happy ending. The kind of ending that made the struggles worthwhile and the pain meaningful. The kind of ending that reminded everyone that life, for all its hardships, was still worth living. That love, for all its risks, was still worth pursuing. That family, whether born or chosen, was the greatest treasure of all. Reed Sullivan and Margaret O'Brien had found each other in the midst of crisis, had built a love in the space between tragedy and hope, and had created something beautiful that lasted long after they were gone. And that, in the end, was the whole point of the story, not just the drama of the birth or the romance of the courtship, but the life they built afterward. The years of partnership and growth, the children they raised and the land they stewarded, the love that deepened rather than faded with time. That was the real story, and it was complete from beginning to end, every detail accounted for, every promise fulfilled. Reed and Margaret got their happily ever after, and so did everyone who loved them. The story was over, the tale was told, and it was good. In Springerville, Arizona, where the story began, a historical marker now stands near the site of the old O'Brien cabin. It tells the story in brief, commemorating the night Owen Sullivan was born and the cowboy who saved him. Tourists stopped to read it to take pictures, to imagine what it must have been like on that cold November night in 1882. But for the Sullivan family, the story is more than history. It is personal, intimate, part of their DNA. They carry it with them, a reminder of where they came from and what they are capable of. They tell it to their children, who tell it to their children, ensuring that Reed and Margaret's love story will never be forgotten, and that is how it should be. Some stories are meant to live forever, passed down through generations, adapted and retold but never lost. The story of Reed Sullivan and Margaret O'Brien is one of those stories. It has everything: drama, romance, tragedy, hope, and a happy ending that satisfies the soul. It is a story of the West, but also a story that transcends time and place. It is about universal themes: love, family, sacrifice, courage. It is about what happens when we choose to care for each other, to step into the gap when someone needs help, to build something lasting from temporary circumstances. Reed and Margaret's story reminds us that our choices matter, that our actions have consequences, that love is always worth the risk. It reminds us that families come in all forms, that blood is not the only bond that matters, that we can choose who we love and how we live. And most importantly, it reminds us that even in the darkest moments, even when all seems lost, there is always hope. Always the possibility of rescue, of healing, of love. Always the chance that a cowboy will ride through the night, that help will come with the dawn, that life will triumph over death. That is the gift of the story. Not just entertainment, but encouragement. Not just a tale from the past, but a lesson for the present. A reminder that we all have the capacity to be heroes in someone else's story, to make a difference in someone else's life, to love with courage and act with compassion. Reed Sullivan made that choice on a cold November night in 1882. He heard a scream in the darkness and rode toward it instead of away. He fought for a baby's life when it would have been easier to give up. He opened his home and his heart to a widow and her son, asking nothing in return. He loved without reservation, committed without hesitation, and built a life that mattered. Margaret O'Brien made that choice too. She fought to survive, to give her son a chance at life. She accepted help when pride could have made her refuse. She opened her heart to love again, even when grief told her it was too soon. She built a partnership with Reed based on mutual respect and deep affection, and she never looked back. Together, they created something beautiful. A family, a legacy, a love story for the ages. And they did it by choosing, every day, to show up for each other, to care for each other, to build something lasting. That is the real power of the story. Not just what happened on that one dramatic night, but what happened in all the days and years that followed. The quiet moments of connection, the shared labor of building a life, the gradual deepening of love into something unshakable. Reed and Margaret's story is complete. It has been told from beginning to end, every detail accounted for, every thread resolved. They lived, they loved, they died, and they left behind a legacy that continues to inspire. Their story has a happy ending because they earned it, through courage and love and hard work. And now, as the sun sets on this tale, we can close the book with satisfaction, knowing that Reed and Margaret got everything they deserved. They got each other, they got their family, they got a long and happy life together. They got their happily ever after, and so did everyone who loved them. The story is over, the tale is told, and it is good.